Hello and welcome to the Our Prenup Lawyer Podcast, where you and I get to learn more about prenups as I interview professionals from the fields of family law, couples counseling, and wealth management. I'm your host, Libby Garabedian. Let's get started. The information provided in this podcast is prepared by Our Prenup Lawyer for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. The information is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship. This is not legal advice or a substitute for obtaining legal advice from an attorney. A person listening or watching should not rely upon it in any manner without engaging professional counsel. The podcast is intended to communicate general information and, because recorded, may not be current. Today we have Michael DiFalco, partner at Aiello DiFalco LLP in Garden City, New York, who is an accomplished family law attorney representing clients in high-stakes divorce, custody, and support cases. Michael has a strong presence in the legal community of New York, having served as chair of the Young Lawyers section of the New York State Bar and holding leadership positions with the Nassau County Bar. Michael's impressive career has been honored with awards including Young Matrimonial Attorney of the Year, multiple New York Super Lawyers, Rising Star listings, and recognition in Best Lawyers, Ones to Watch in Family Law. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for being on the episode. How are you doing?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me.
Great. Let's get right into it. So first I want to start out, how did you get started in family law?
I started working in family law in college, actually. I started clerking at this law firm and continued working at the law school. And I wasn't sure it was going to be the practice area that I focused on when I was in law school, but over the course of probably my 2L year to 3L year, it seemed like a really good fit for me because it combined the litigation that I wanted to do and having courtroom experience, as well as some of the transactional and some of the more personal touches of family law and matrimonial law really appealed to me. And just helping people and helping them navigate through a tough time and deal with some issues was just more meaningful than pushing around paper to deal with a transaction like a real estate closing or something like that. So yeah, that's how I fell into it.
And how's your practice evolved? Is it entirely litigation or is mediation a part of it too?
One of the things that I really like about my practice, and I sort of took this on in part because my partner, who is actually now retired, but practiced for over 40 years, had a very expansive, different modes of practice. I go from cases where it's very amicable and I'm trying to negotiate an agreement outside of court, and there's not a lot of complexity or issues, not a lot of animosity. I have cases that are full-on litigation with many motions filed in court that wind up at trials. So we have complicated trials that last for, dozens of days with testimony from multiple witnesses. And then we also do, mediation. So, and you might have all of that within the course of a week, where you're dealing with, or the course of a day even, you're dealing with certain issues that are much more complicated in one case, but similar issues just dealt with in a different modality to help resolve the issue, through mediation or alternative dispute resolution on another matter. So.
And how is that skill set different when you're transitioning day to day or week to week with different clients? How do you have to, I guess, put on a different hat for those cases?
Yeah, you have to change your perspective a bit. So in mediation, for example, you have to consider the fact that you're not there to advocate for one party's interests, or, you're also not there to give them advice or strategy about how to deal with an issue where maybe their spouse is being unfair or taking a position that is, it's going to disadvantage the other party, and it as the neutral, and you can try to give them advice about going to speak to another attorney and suggesting compromises or say, do you really think that that's fair? But you have to change your perspective. And you also have to change your perspective based on the type of client you're dealing with. You can't tell a client who wants to keep things amicable, you know what, I think you really need to go to court. I think you need to fight for this. You have to let people guide you with what their priorities are and how they want to go about their divorce or family law matter.
So going along with letting the client guide you, what is your philosophy when it comes to divorce or just a split between a couple?
If in an ideal world, everybody would go about it in a way that would, respect the dignity of the relationship, go about it with civility and respect for each other and their children. So I always encourage that when possible, but it's not always possible. But I guess my philosophy for working on most cases is always to be prepared to do what's best for the client by helping them try to settle it. But while you're trying to settle, preparing the case for the possibility that you're not going to resolve the issues outside of court, and you need to be able to present the right evidence and prepare for trial and do all those things that you need to do. So we always took a two-track approach to handling matters and making sure that through being diligent and effectively prepared to litigate a case, it often results in a better settlement for the client.
So how do the mediation and divorce processes look different when there's a prenup in place and when the couple doesn't have one?
Well, it really helps provide clarity about what the parties intended. Just recently, I have a matter where I'm the mediator and in a post-nuptial agreement, but very similar to a prenuptial agreement that deals with certain issues. So it's very helpful to remind the clients, well, a couple of years ago, when you guys went through this process of having lawyers draft this post-nuptial agreement to decide what you wanted to do with the house or to do with these different assets, you came to an agreement. So what's changed since then? And why is that, not the preferred option? How do we go about this in a way that reminds people that some of these issues are already clarified and dealt with in an agreement? It really simplifies things. It doesn't always solve every issue, and it doesn't always resolve, even as, the distribution of assets or the resolution of an issue that the parties might have thought they provided some answers. It might provide some guidance. And so, we work as the attorneys to try to understand what the parties intended, how the legal drafting actually, took place, what the parties then did during the marriage, and figure out how the prenup interrelates with the facts on the ground. Like, what did they actually do? There's types and cases, there's a prenup that, deals with a certain intention, but the parties didn't follow it to the T during the marriage, or there needs to be some accounting or some other adjustments that need to be done to figure out, well, how does this actually get applied now, several years later?
If the goal is to have a prenup that is clear, it's easy to follow with divorce proceedings or whatever may happen, what's your process when you're tasked with writing a prenup or a postnup to ensure that there's nothing convoluted later on?
Well, one of the first questions I ask people when I talk to them about their potential prenup or postnup is, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? It's a very different approach if your goal, for example, is to protect a family business that your grandfather started, and that's really all you're concerned about. That's a much more limited focus than somebody who wants to make sure that all of the assets that they acquired during the marriage through their hard work are protected completely from their spouse. Then there's people who have very uncertain views about what they actually want. So you have to sort of help them understand what the options are and what different provisions we can include in a prenup or postnup, and present them with those options, then work to tailor them to what they actually need or want. But it's really important to find a way that the parties to discuss what they view their financial future to look like and what they'd like to see, and then try to draft it as clearly as possible. The other thing that's really important from my perspective is because I litigate divorces and I deal with these issues, knowing what might present in a complicated divorce 20 years down the road, you can sometimes see things that the clients are not going to see about how their prenup might play out in a divorce. If, for example, somebody stays home and raises children, or, what happens if, for example, retirement assets are treated as separate property. You could see that can have a significant impact on their finances in a way that somebody who's in their late 20s and, is just thinking about getting married and not really focused on, what their retirement looks like at 55 or 65 may not be thinking about.
So going off that idea of preparing for the future, at what point, if a couple does have a prenup, should they consider making amendments to it so that it becomes a postnup?
So one of the main issues that I see when we have people come back for postnups, it's often if there has been, for example, somebody has a significance of a property, estate, or somebody owns the home that the parties live in. You sometimes see people after being married for several years and having children, recognizing that maybe the initial anxiety about getting married, or the concerns about protecting that asset are a little less significant. They see that the marriage is viable, and they want to make sure that their partner has some certainty about what's going to happen, particularly with the marital home. That's probably the biggest one I see. We also see situations where people stop working, or who have children and need to make adjustments to the fact that this is a long-term, or will be a long-term marriage, and they want to make sure that they can discuss these issues openly and come to some sort of amendment with the post-now.
Now, if you do have one person who's giving up their career to stay at home and raise the couple's children, how can you equalize the marriage in the prenup itself?
Well, in New York, marriage is an economic partnership, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, everybody is just being looked at for their economic contributions. There's a lot of non-economic contributions, taking care of children, supporting your spouse, taking care of the home. These are all viewed as significant contributions to the partnership. So I think that one of the issues that comes up in prenups is, well, how are you going to, how is your family going to interact? What's the plan? And not everybody has a plan, especially I deal with a lot of young professionals. People don't necessarily see themselves in a very traditional, gender role or traditional situation where, I'm going to stay home and take care of children. But I say, well, what happens if the child's disabled? What happens if you decide, your partner gets a great job in California and you want to move, but it means you can't go with them to take this, a new role at your job, and you have to take a step back. So those are the things we talk about with people to figure out, well, how do we, predict what might happen or issues that might occur? And the main issue that presents in these types of situations is spousal maintenance. Formula for spousal maintenance was complicated in New York, and there's a lot of discretionary factors. However, it's important to just think about the possibility. From an initial drafting stage, is there a possibility that there may be a need for maintenance in the future? And if so, a waiver of maintenance it can be significant, and it could really put one party at a disadvantage. So that's probably the most direct issue that needs to be discussed when you're talking about these different economic and non-economic contributions to a marriage.
And thinking about spousal maintenance and possible child support in the future, those are obviously difficult conversations to have. How do you as a mediator use your skills to facilitate communication between couples so that that drafting a prenup doesn't become an adversarial process?
Well, so I think most prenups are drafted in the context of both parties have an attorney and they're getting advice from their respective attorneys, but it isn't adversarial. It is much more collaborative, and the goal is to get these people married happily. So, they need an agreement to make them feel comfortable with certain issues. We can help them craft that in the right way, but they might have different priorities. I think that it's not about maximizing their potential benefit from a prenup, and it's about giving them good counsel. Say, did you think about this? Did you consider the possibility that 10 years from now, you might be in a different situation? And that's also, when you're talking to the partner or the potential spouse who has the higher income, it's also about talking to them about, well, you might not be thinking about, like, you want to protect yourself and you don't want to be paying maintenance, but what about the fact that what if your partner does stay home and take care of, twins for 5 years, and at that point you realize that you no longer want to be married? Should they be left high and dry, or should there be a period of time when they get a little bit of help? And how do we then discuss the ramifications of that? Do we mitigate the approach? Do we have a partial waiver of maintenance if there's no children? Do we have a partial waiver of maintenance if they're not married very long? Do we put in new different sort of terms to minimize the potential exposure to maintenance? Those are the ways we kind of discuss them depending on which party you're representing. And I think you have to be respectful of the other parties. Like, you have to understand that the other attorney and the other party might have a different perspective. And so that you just try to find alignment as best you can to reach a compromise with respect to the provisions about something like this, which is so discretionary, but also fraught with a lot of emotion.
Have you ever run into a situation where one side has brought forth a prenup where the terms are so egregious that you've had to tell your client just to walk away?
I've suggested to at least 2 or 3 clients that I do not think that they should sign their proposed prenuptial agreement. My understanding is that at least 2 of them went ahead and signed it because they wanted to be married more than they wanted to have a fair prenup. But I think that there are times when it's not even so egregious necessarily. It's just that sometimes I think people fail to understand that what's being done is they're being put in a position where all of the assets are going to be kept in one party's name because there's going to be very limited opportunities for there to be any marital property. And then you tie that with some waivers of maintenance and a real disparity in income and future earning potential. And you really do wind up in a situation where, there's no real economic benefit or legal benefit to the marriage. So you have to question, why are they proceeding? And could they wind up in a situation where 15 or 25 years from now, they've been married a long time and they have some real economic hardship if they were to proceed with a divorce?
At what point in a couple's relationship should they then start maybe discussing a prenup or just discussing their plan for the future?
Look, I mean, I'm a romantic. I don't think you should discuss it on the first date, but I think you should probably start talking about it after you're engaged and when you've had some serious discussions. But my hope is that people who are actually thinking about prenups and thinking about these things are having more open communication about their finances and what their expectations are during their relationship, maybe even before the engagement. I think that's a very healthy thing to do. I think it's also much better to start talking about these things before you're, in the midst of wedding planning. And then it feels very abrupt to suddenly say, look, my family wants me to get a prenup, or I think we should have a prenup, and, have a hard time discussing it. But we have a clear, open dialogue about what kind of economic partnership you want. Early on, I think you can have a very successful discussion about what kind of prenup would make sense for your particular dynamic.
And what's the difference between a prenup for a couple on their first marriage versus their second or third, maybe where they've started a business or accumulated more wealth?
Very different scenarios, because almost everybody who's been married 2 or 3 times has had at least a bad experience going through a divorce. So they have a very different perspective. I think that most second marriages that I see from my former divorce clients seem to be much happier and much more mature, and they're better fits. But often those people come back and look for a prenup, in part because they went through a very, rough divorce. So there was a lot of, economic issues that resulted from it. I think that the other aspect of it is that those later in life marriages and those marriages that are the second or third, there's usually children from a prior marriage. And so people want to make sure that their estates are protected and that they're leaving something to their children, often on both sides. They want to make sure that their house goes to their kids or something like that. And so those are different discussions than, a young couple that is, there might be a 401k, maybe an apartment or some other, assets, but they really haven't built wealth and they haven't had to share half of their, established wealth with their former partner yet. So it's just a very different discussion. So
what advice would you give to a couple that is debating whether or not to get a prenup?
I think that, it's sometimes seen as a bit unromantic, and it's sometimes seen as, really taboo almost for people to discuss a prenup. But I think that those folks who actually, plan for their futures and who think about their finances and who, look at their retirement accounts and think about how they're going to save for their eventual retirement, to their kids' college, or whatever is going to happen in the future. There's types of people who, buy insurance and who think about these things. It's a how do we go about this in a way that's like, what if? Most people who successfully complete the prenuptial agreement process and come about it with the right attitude, I find, are just folks who are trying to plan for their futures and want to have some security. They want to have an insurance policy. They want to make sure that if the marriage does not last, there's at least some clarity about how some of the assets or other issues will be resolved. But they always, want to, they should be looking at it as like, we'll come to an agreement. hopefully it gets signed, put in a drawer or safe deposit box, and we don't look at it ever again. But if you do need to look at it, sometime down the road, you don't know where you're going to be or what's going to be the financial circumstances when you're looking at it. And you want to know that it's well drafted and that it provides some clarity for your situation.
So it's more of just a safety net for their financial future. And
absolutely, people don't buy travel insurance for their trips, but they don't buy it for certain to like make sure that their trip is going to fail or be canceled. They buy it because they want to be able to go on that great trip, but feel some measure of like, what if, I get sick, or what if something happens and, grandma's ill and I need to cancel my, my honeymoon, my trip, whatever it might be. So I think that it's very similar. It's just a method of feeling a little bit more protected about what might happen in the future.
What do you believe is key to a successful marriage from all the ugly divorces you've seen, but also the happy marriages you've also seen?
Look, I think that communication and openness is probably the most fundamental thing. People need to understand what they need, what they want, and be able to communicate it to their partners. I think that talking about money is also one of the main problems for a lot of marriages. Sometimes it's because one party is taking on the role. Maybe they earn more. Maybe they're just better with the numbers. Maybe they just like it more. And so you wind up in situations where some of the bad marriages are stressed because there's issues with financial strain, or there's a period of time that is difficult, especially early on when people are just starting out. But having open dialogue about money is really important for marriages. I can't tell you how many divorces I've done where people come in and they say, I don't know what I have. I don't know what my spouse has. I think that he might have a 401k. I don't know what's outstanding on the mortgage. I'm not really sure about anything. That's a problem. And you shouldn't find yourself in that position after being married for 20 years and having a couple of kids and, being with somebody. These are issues that you should be talking about. So one of the benefits of the prenup is really that it forces people to have some discussion early on before they're married about their respective finances. And, even if it's just a discussion about what kind of expectations they have about a marriage, it can be very helpful in opening that dialogue as people go about their marriages.
So we're finding out that communication is key.
Yeah.
So how can listeners reach you if they're interested in connecting?
Well, I'm happy to speak to anybody about a potential prenup or an issue. In New York, of course, I'm only admitted there, but I do deal with people internationally in different scenarios, cross borders in different jurisdictions. My website is matlawyers.com. That's MAT as in matrimonial. I think that there's a lot of information on the website as well, a lot of articles and blogs about prenups and other materials, which might be helpful if somebody's just looking for some general information.
Great. Thank you. And we will have your website in the episode description so people can go ahead and click on it from there.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.